So, welcome. We'll just let the last few people get settled. So this is the workshop on collaborative governance. So hopefully this is the one you want to be at. If not, you can exit. I'm Liz Weaver, and I work for Tamarack, as you all probably know, but it's always good to remind you. And the workshop actually comes out of from two lenses. And one lens is, you know, the work that I did in Hamilton, working for the Hamilton Roundtable for Poverty Reduction. But the second lens really comes from the work that we're doing right across Canada with these collaborative roundtables. And also really kind of looking at how governance applies within the collective impact context. And so we've been doing some thinking about it in Canada. So hopefully some of the things will be helpful to you. So when you were thinking about coming to this workshop today, what were some of the questions? I saw all the questions that were raised about collaborative governance, but are there some questions that you'd like to particularly kind of have addressed during the course of this workshop? And hopefully I'll have some slides for it. If not, I'll just freewheel it. Yeah.
I'm kind of interested in knowing how to structure governance.
Okay.
Ours is an older collaborative, sort of, but I'm new. So we were thinking of having like maybe a 12-person partner
Table.
Yes,
Yeah.
table for really decision-making, quick decision-making.
Yeah.
But then have the wider community leadership committee with a lot more stakeholders and people of experience. And, you know, so I'm just wondering how to do that. And is that an idea? Is that kind of the way it can be done?
Yeah. And I've actually got a design that we have seen typically evolve in Canada. For a structure and also a model that not only is being used in Canada, but I work with the United States Breastfeeding Committee, and they're adapting the model to the work that they do. So it's quite cool. So we're going to talk about those. Yeah. Yes.
So two. One is how can electeds fit in a helpful way?
How can
elected officials?
Okay.
And then also, how do you handle governance and collective impact? We have so many decision makers at the table. You hear so many decision makers that no decisions are made.
Yeah.
Challenge.
Okay. Those are really good questions. Yeah.
I guess what are some key decision points that you face as you're developing your governance structure, and what might be some reasons for taking one decision rather than another as you?
Okay. Yeah. Here and then back there. Yes.
You're perfect.
Yeah.
In the early stages, how do you put the collaborative in governance when you haven't yet defined your shared measurement, and the voice of the funders are often quite different from the voice of the citizens?
Yeah. Okay. It's a good question, actually. We had so we did something in Hamilton. I'm just going to take a little bit of a segue because I don't actually have a slide about this, but we had the table talk about how the issue affected them personally. So when you're dealing with an issue like poverty or homelessness or, you know, the environment, if you ask people around the leadership table, how does this issue affect you as an individual living in this community right now? What you get is a deeper connection to this whole thing about collaboration, right? Because everybody is affected in some way, or they can craft a story around it, and so that becomes a bit of a level playing field. And what's also really good is those stories become really powerful and become part of the collaborative ethic moving forward. So, yes?
My question is, when the backbone organization is also the primary funder, how do you achieve authentic collaborative governance?
So we call that the challenge of the powerful host. So you'll hear me talk about that.
And to follow on that, how do you put the power out in the community without losing track of the ambitious, time-bound impact goals?
Yeah. That's the tension. You know, this work is all about living in tension, right? I think about it a lot as an elastic, and you're pulled at either end of the elastic. And so how do you, there are things that often seem to be contradictory to one another, and you can't let the elastic snap. You've got to figure out what's the right balance for your table, and when do you actually start to surface these things when you're out of tension, right? When you're feeling like we're way over here and not getting over here. So the difficult conversations that come in continuous communications. Yeah, Brad.
Our collective impact was started by a group of national actors
Yeah.
who decided to work in a particular region or locale, and now believe that we need to create systems in the location. So there's a steering committee in the local level. We still have the national group of leadership, the relationship between a national entity that wanted to work in multiple sites and any local entity. So it's a kind of two-layered governance.
Yeah. And in fact, it's really interesting because that's what we have with the poverty work we're doing in Canada, is Tamarack acts as the national backbone to the staffing of the infrastructures, the collaborative entities that exist in the community. So it's kind of a nested approach, and I think we're starting to see, both in Canada and the US, more of that nesting, right? And there are different roles and responsibilities that happen at the different layers, right? There's much more of a local context, but there are things that a national can bring that adds value, like a common evaluation framework across all of them, right? We work on a common policy framework as well. So what is bubbling up from the local communities that would help shift a policy at a national level, but then how do we also transfer policy, successful policies that are working at the local level, how do we transfer those across each of the communities so that we can get that policy shift happening? And that's the real value of having a national intervention, but what you need at the local level is a learning community, right? So you need to have your local players connected in some way that they can learn from each other, and that's, again, a role for the national to play. A couple more, and then we'll get into the context. Yeah.
Just to add to that, the concept of cascading communication and
Yes.
making sure that it's going, looking for recommendations or considerations for creating those communications so that they're flowing both way and enforcing each other.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, you really have to understand that the national is not involved in the doing, the day-to-day doing. What they're doing, their focus should be in moving the whole thing forward, right? And so you really do have to understand what are the discrete roles that both the national collective impact backbone will play, and what are the distinct roles that the local backbones will play. One more, yeah.
Yeah, any suggestion in regards to if you have in a region or city already a number of collaborative coalitions around the same issue, and how to bring them all together under collaborative governance?
Yeah. That's always challenging because I'm going to talk about context, and that would really, context is a really important factor there, right? Do you have a history in your community of being collaborative in this kind of way, or is it fragmented, and what does that look like, and those kinds of things. So yeah, we will talk about community context as one of the things to be thinking about. In any kind of structure that people can only remember 5 things plus or minus 2. So if you think about the 5 conditions of collective impact, John Kenya and Mark Kramer have it right? 5 conditions. So 7 is the plus 2. You know, so I'm going to talk about the collaboration spectrum, and we always start with that at Tamarack, right? Because, you know, some people will say, well, this is all how we've been working forever. You know, what's new about collective impact? And I think it is important to situate it on the collaboration spectrum. I'm going to talk about complexity. John talked a little bit about it yesterday in terms, and he'll be talking a little bit more, I think, tomorrow about emergence. But this work really is situated in complexity. And we can't have simple solutions to complex problems, right? And so we'll talk a little bit about that. I'm going to give you a little flavor of the eco-cycle, how we have planned this work as campaigns at Tamarack, but I'm doing a session, a tool session on the eco-cycle. So I'll give you the flavor of it, but I won't go very deep in it. The context is the next one, so really being aware of the local context or the state or provincial context in which you work or the national context in which you work, that's really critical. And what are some of the key things to look at in terms of context? The collaborative premise, this actually comes out of some work in the United States by a guy named David Crislip. Does anybody know David? So he wrote the Collaborative Leadership Field Book a number of years ago, and a key to the field book is this idea of a collaborative premise. And so I think it is something to raise up. I always think, you know, there's the collective impact work, but there are lots of people that preceded it that were thinking about this. They just didn't frame it in the same way, and David Crislip is one of those folks. A couple of slides around structures that we've seen evolve across Canada. We actually don't talk a lot about backbone organizations. We use the word infrastructure because we think it actually sets a little bit of a different context. And so, John and I were just talking about that over lunch, and I think, you know, it's for people and other organizations that exist in a community, using the word infrastructure is a little bit more palatable for them, right? It doesn't feel as competitive. And then the constellation model of governance is this model that we've used a lot in Canada in terms of how do you manage this, and is there even a model that has some adaptation to working in collective impact governance? And it's a really great model. It's a little bit, you know, sometimes in Canada we're a little bit wonky, so it has like elements of it. They have a magnetic attractor, but bear with it. It's actually a really good model. So those are my 7 big ideas. So this is the collaboration spectrum, and you probably all have seen iterations of this, you know, collaboration continuums. The reason why we like this one in Canada is because competition is part of the collaboration spectrum in this version of it, right? And we want to acknowledge that in any type of collaborative work, there is always going to be competition. We're competing for resources, we're competing for share of mind, we're competing for marketing, we're competing for people to come into the programs and services, we're competing for clients to be impacted by the work that we're doing. So you really do have to acknowledge that competition is there. The box actually shows you where collective impact is situated, right? It's really at the end of the continuum that says, we're going to be much more intentional about coordinating our efforts, collaborating our efforts, and even, you know, even though we don't want to talk about it, even maybe going into that world of integration of efforts. There are 2 things to really think about in this collaboration continuum. At the end of competition, there's actually much more turf, and there are things, or spectrum. There's much more turf embedded in that work, and you know, we are as organizations in this work more loosely coupled together. As you start to move along the spectrum and you think, okay, we are actually going to work in an intentional kind of collective impact way, you do have to figure out how are we going to build trust amongst the diverse partners that we're bringing around the table, because they're all coming with expectations, they all have different ways of working, they all are, you know, some of them are thinking, yeah, I'm going to jump in with 2 feet, others are kind of holding the cards a little close to their vests and things like that. So what are those things that you're going to do that really are trust building kinds of activities, right? And particularly, you know, my field of experience is really to bring the voice of people with lived experience to the table. That actually does really say, okay, how are we going to do that in a way that is authentic and that we're balancing the power dynamics around this table, right? So that person is there with the elected official, with the head of a corporation, you know, with the director of education. How do we make sure that their voices are heard? And it really actually does make you think about coordinating your efforts, you know, setting up your meetings in a very different way, looking at locations, thinking about the structure of how you're going to kind of surface their voice, how you're going to support their voice during the course of the work that you're doing. It's really important to figure out those kinds of things. Otherwise, what happens is you just actually increase levels of mistrust, right? So thinking about that is critical. The other thing I think is really important to acknowledge on this spectrum is that when you actually get to the level of integration, that means that something has to end. So there's a great story in Hamilton. We have 5 shelters, right? And the shelters wanted to work together more intentionally so that they better serve the people coming to these homeless shelters at night. So one shelter was a dry shelter, and another shelter was a palliative care shelter, and another shelter was okay if you drank alcohol and things like that. So they started sending the clients to the most appropriate shelter. Then they said it's not about hots and cots, it's about actually getting people housed. So they actually were able to negotiate with funders and the hospitals and that kind of thing, a different kind of situation. 172 clients of the shelters actually got housed, but that meant that all 5 shelters had 30% less capacity. Someone had to step up to the plate and say, we're going to close. That creates so much wobbliness in the system, right? Because it is. You know, they are moving towards integration. They're moving towards really good outcomes for the people that they're serving in a kind of a collective impact kind of way. But it also says our jobs, one of our shelters, our jobs are going to end, and the people that are engaged there, this is a reality for you. So that says that that group has to have high degree of trust amongst each other, and then they have to kind of problem solve that together. So this collective impact work will really surface some of those really challenging issues. And so you really do, I said this yesterday, and I firmly believe it, those principles for working together are critical in this work, and critical in the governance structure. Okay, so this is the second big idea. This is about complexity, and John talked a little bit about this. Who's seen the Stasi Matrix before? A couple of you, yeah? So there are different kinds of problems that exist in our communities, in our states, in our federal government level. You know, there are simple problems, and that's the problem that John talked about, you know, baking a cake, right? Even, you know, we might not get the best outcomes, but even the most dysfunctional of us can actually put the recipe together and get to the solution. There are complicated problems, and they actually require more of a technical solution. So an example of that is sending a rocket to the moon, right? So you can get to the result if you have all the right technical expertise lined up. You actually can get to the outcome of the person getting to the moon. On the way here on the airplane, I watched a 2-part video about the guy who jumped from space, the Austrian guy who jumped from space. And what was really interesting watching that was just all the technical decision making that had to happen to make that happen successfully, right? All the stuff in behind, you know, the fact that the day that he was going to go up the first time, the balloon crashed, and wind came and the balloon crashed. And so there were lots of things. So it's a complicated problem, but if you have the right technical things, you can get to the solution. And then there are political problems in our communities. And so a political problem is you have to get to some level of agreement to be able to solve that political problem, right? I think that my assessment of the United States is you guys there's a lot of tension in the political problem areas here. What? Yeah, I only get that from Jon Stewart. Yeah. And then there are those problems that are complex, right? And they exist in the zone of complexity, which is in the middle. And the zone of complexity says that there actually isn't a single solution. You know, you can't, John used the analogy yesterday of raising children, right? You have 2 children, and because of where they are in the birth order and because of who they are in their personalities, you can have all the same strategies and have totally different outcomes, right? And that means that we have to use different kinds of strategies when we're trying to solve problems that exist in the zone of complexity. And a lot of the collective impact work actually exists in this zone of complexity. The final type of problem that exists out there is the chaotic problem. So Hurricane Katrina is an example of a chaotic problem. You can't actually get a lot of decision makers. What you actually need is order and control to be able to solve that chaotic problem, right? You need a command and control kind of response. But if you don't also look for innovation in that, you actually miss the opportunity that comes out of a chaotic problem. So these are characteristics of complex problems. They're difficult to frame. So poverty is a good example of that, right? So do we frame it as food insecurity or income insecurity or housing insecurity or economic insecurity or social inclusion? I mean, there's a whole bunch of lenses, right? Access to healthcare, access to recreation. Poverty can be that. And so how you frame it is going to be a real challenge for your collective impact work, is how you frame the complex issue, and where you land on the complex issue is a really critical component of it, right? The cause and effect relationships are sometimes unclear, right? So you can think that poverty is about income, but there's so many other factors that come into play. And I used to say, when I was doing the work in Hamilton, when we started, we had 92,000 people that were living in poverty. I said, you need 92,000 different solutions, right? Because each experience is different. And so you can have policy-based solutions, but that's not going to help all those 96,000. That will help a certain amount of them, might help the working poor, but might not necessarily help the men in the homeless shelters, right? So again, cause and effect is unclear. There are lots of diverse stakeholders that are impacted and engaged with the issue. Mostly impacted. So if you think about education and you're trying to do a cradle to career initiative, the stakeholders are from soup to nuts, right? You've got parents, you've got the kids, you've got the teachers, you've got the directors of education, you've got the healthcare providers, you've got, who else would you have in that continuum? Cradle to career. Who's working in cradle to career stuff? Who are some other stakeholders?
Well, you have your faith-based, your community-based, your business, labor,
Yeah.
government,
Yeah.
parents, community,
Yeah.
education,
Yeah.
hiring.
And all of them have a slightly different opinion and have different needs connected to the outcomes, right, of what you're trying to do. Each experience is unique. I talked about that. The characteristics and dynamics change over time. So when we started this work of poverty in Canada 12 years ago, we had one province with a poverty strategy. We now have 8 of 10 and 3 territories, right? So we have virtually all of Canada covered with province-wide strategy. So that has been quite a big evolution for us over a very short period of time. So the dynamics are continually shifting, and you have to always connect into those shifting dynamics. There's no obvious right or wrong set of solutions, right? That you actually can take multiple approaches. We had a discussion before everybody came into the room about this whole idea of prototyping that John talked about, right? That actually will help you kind of say, let's try this strategy. It doesn't work. Did it move the needle? Didn't it? So how do we prototype some of those strategies? And then the no objective measure of success. I think we're trying to get closer to that, right? I think that we are trying with shared measurement and evaluation to figure out what is our shared kind of measurement. But you might even have, with one of your stakeholders, you might actually see an increase in graduation rates, but only for certain populations, right? And so other populations will say, well, that's great, but it didn't affect me. Or you might see an increase in enrollment in college and university, but not in the trades or the areas that the community needs, right? So you've got to really see how things are connected. So dealing with different kinds of problems. For a simple problem, what you want to do is figure out what the right recipe is and follow it, make sense. With a complicated problem, it's really about having the experts bring their expertise to bear and experiment. With a political problem, you've got to think about where is the common ground between where we are in our position and where you are. Can you come closer to that kind of common ground, right? And then with a complex problem, it's really about learning by doing, that prototyping notion, and then chaotic, it's the idea of creating stability. So 2 big ideas already. Any questions before we go on to this third big idea? So first is the collaboration spectrum. Did that resonate with you guys? Did you think, oh, I have a question about that? Anybody? Those are closed questions. How did that resonate with you guys? Yes.
I actually have a question. So in terms of assessing where you're at,
Yes.
I'm assuming that you'll find partners at different points. Is that true?
Yeah,
So
you
how-
absolutely will. What is really, I've used it as a tool actually, the spectrum. I've brought it to a collaborative table and I've asked people, well, where are we at, right?
And who's the we?
Yes, where are we at? And then people start to identify. And then you ask the second question, well, are we okay with being at this place? Are we comfortable? Do we want to move, right? And it really is interesting because people will think that they're at different places on the collaboration spectrum. They'll say that. The other thing that's really interesting about the collaboration spectrum is some people will want to move and other people won't, right? And so then what does that mean for the collaborative table? The other thing that I've noticed with you know, kind of single sector collaboration and sometimes with multi-sector collaboration is that you start off with decision makers and then as it evolves, right, you keep going down that decision-making chain. And so that's, again, where the principles of why we're here are critical, right? Because if you go down the chain and people are sending their second in command and their third in command, the table that used to be a decision-making table no longer is a decision-making table. And that's frustrating. And then what do people do? They vote by their feet. They just don't come to meetings. And you know who's had it where they sent out a notice of meeting about a collaboration and you think, where the heck is everybody? Well, they're telling you something, right? It's not an effective collaboration. So it can be a really useful tool to get people around the table onto the same page. And in an unthreatening kind of way, right? You could say, we're really trying to figure this out. What about the zone of complexity here, the Stasi Matrix? I went over it really quickly, but it is, you know, it is, I think, important around collective impact work to think that we are in this zone of complexity, that things are shifting all the time, and we have to really, as leaders, whether we're a member of the backbone, staffing infrastructure, or we're a member around the collaborative table, we've got to be in tune with how things are shifting, you know, because that'll allow us to kind of move with the shifts. Yeah?
Where would a community organizing model fall?
What do you mean?
I'm just wondering, is that an example of collective impact or?
Like a neighborhood revitalization kind of model?
Like communities choosing issues they want to move forward and.
That's interesting. I think if it's single sector, it isn't collective impact, right? It's the degree to which it becomes multi-sector and that you have diverse voices. So a community, there are neighborhood revitalization initiatives that start to bring in the business community and bring in local government partners and bring in voluntary sector organizers and bring in the citizens. And you know, there's some really effective models of those. And I would say those are more collective impact. But where it is only about the neighborhood, the neighbors talking to one another, it wouldn't necessarily, in my opinion, it wouldn't necessarily be a collective impact. It's when you bring in the other partners and the other lenses. Yeah.
So, you know, with one of the tenets of collective impact being having these kind of key indicators that you're moving toward, I feel like in that is a solution that's kind of answered. So we pursue third grade reading level, for example. So I'm thinking about how that fits into the fact that we're working mostly with complex problems, and that we need to be agile in our solutions to them. So how do collective impact movements tend to change those indicators every few years?
Yeah, I would say no. I would say, I think what, you know, if you were in the workshop with Faye, there's a whole set of things around collective impact. So there are the top level, population level indicators, and they should stay the same. Right? But then there are performance. We use kind of a 4P process in Canada. Performance measures, process, progress, population level, and policy. And so we have a whole set of measures that really start to fill in the frame. But I think that the population level, If you were to shift indicators a lot, it actually takes away from the integrity of the work that you're trying to do. And population level indicators do take 5 years to shift. You know, so you're in the work for that long at least.
Going back to the continuity of collaboration a little bit.
Yeah.
So when I think about some of the people who serve on our steering committee, part of what we're asking them to do is code switch. You know, when they come to the collective impact organization, they have to look at things with a different frame than they do when they're the head of their organization or their government agency and they're the decision maker.
Yeah.
So suggestions around how, I mean, in our case, our steering committee meets quarterly.
Yeah. I think that's where, if you think, for those of you that read intensely the first paper on collective impact, there are 3 preconditions of collective impact. And I just actually think those 3 preconditions, if you get them right, you start as you mean to go. And the first precondition is this idea of influential champions, right? I think we have to have better discussions around our collaborative tables, our collective impact tables around what does it mean to be an influential champion? And how are you in your organization going to change your way of work so that you're an early adopter of this change that we're wanting to see in our community? So it's not only you as a champion, but it's your sphere of influence as well. And how can your sphere of influence really push us forward faster? Because if you can get those people that are the champions around your table, whether it's the community foundation saying, you know, we're going to spend a portion of our money trying to get to these educational outcomes. And you've got the director of education saying, you know what, we're going to talk about the systems in our school board that can shift to get to these educational outcomes. So you've got the business community saying, you know, our role is that we're going to invest in schools in a more pragmatic way. That's our priority investment, right? So it's really starting with your inner circle and getting them to say what could they do as the early adopters, and then spreading the circle wider and wider and wider. And that, I think, you know, I think that's really critical. And sometimes we invite the influential champions in. It's kind of like fundraising, right? We kind of think, we'll have a conversation with you, but we never close the ask. So we invite them in, but then we don't close the ask, right? And it is really getting them to think it through and then really promoting what they're doing so that they get credit early on that they are the early adopters, and more people will come to the initiative. Okay, we're going to go on to the third big idea. So you're only going to get like an hors d'oeuvre of this idea. So most of us who are working in organizations, in collaboration, in collective impact, we live in the performance loop, right? So we birth something, we scale it up, and then it gets to maturity, and then we birth something else, and we add it on top, and we add it on top, and we add it on top, and we add it on top. Then we wonder why we're so tired, right? Because we don't let anything go. So the eco-cycle actually has this kind of renewal loop, which actually makes you think about what is the essence. We've matured it, and you get the law of diminishing returns. What is the essence of what we want to bring forward into our next iteration? And what are the things that we don't have to support to go forward because they're actually not effective anymore? It kind of comes out of fires, right, and ecology. The eco-cycle comes out of ecology. It actually starts at the bottom here. You would think it starts at exploration, but it actually starts at creative destruction, right? Or renewal, for those of you that don't like creative destruction. So something happens in our organizations that makes us, or in our collaborative tables, or in this collective impact work, there is some kind of bad outcome that is happening in our communities that says we got to do something new, right? We have to address poverty because 96,000 people or 92,000 people are living in poverty. So we have to destroy the way that we've always done it and form this table to create something new. Then you get to the exploration phase, which is really the great phase. It's kind of, if you think about the phases of collective impact, it's actually phase number 1 where everybody has lots of ideas and you have lots of community discussions, and you know, the world is your roadmap. You're expanding possibilities and buy-in. Then you hit the pivot point of choice. Where are we going to land? Where are we going to start? with our collective impact work. You develop your structures and your infrastructures, and then you start to do your plan, right? That's phase, exploration is phase 1, development is phase 2, and going up to maturity is phase 3, and then creative destruction, you're coming into phase 4. It's actually, you know, at Tamarack, what we've observed is every 3 to 5 years, organizations go through this pattern, and actually collective impact initiatives go through this pattern as well. We may not want to acknowledge it, but it is the reality, right? Governments change, leadership changes, people come, people go, new initiatives. It's kind of like we do strategic planning, but when we do strategic planning, we never really talk about what are we going to let go, right? We just keep adding new things, new priorities. So this allows us to let go of some things. These are characteristics of each of the 4 phases and what it feels like. So for those of you that are in early stage collective impact initiatives, you're probably feeling the burden of too many ideas, right? Everybody has different kind of things that you could do, and you have a total lack of focus. And so that's a real big burden in the first phase. In your developmental phase, you know, you've got people that really want to put a lot of structure and form to it, right? Those are people that really love that development phase. And then others who want to just be fluid and go with the flow and things like that. So you've got to balance those two. In the scaling up, what happens is you start to get results, you know, and then you get really addicted to those results, right? You think, okay, we're going to get these results all the time, but the community context is changing, something happens, and you get a law of diminishing returns. And nobody likes the creative destruction phase, but it happens, right? You lose funding. A staff person leaves, a key leader in your initiative leaves. There's something that will send you to the bottom, and you've got to kind of figure it out. So that's the hors d'oeuvre. When you come to the tool, if you come to the tool, I'm going to talk about the traps in each of the 4 areas, because there's really interesting traps. So what we've learned, so those of you that know I like cycle racing, there they are. That team is BMC at the very front. And it was had a lot of Americans on it. Anyways, so the lessons that we've learned about the eco cycle or the life cycle or the phases are that you should plan for 3 to 5 years. And really, realistically, in collective impact work, if you have a shorter term campaign, you have lots of enthusiasm, right? People can be in it with you for 3 to 5 years. And when you get to renewal, what happens is if you've had really good success in that time, you'll get more people coming into the work, right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. But if you say, you know, we're going to be at this for the next 100 years trying to solve poverty, yeah, people walk away. Different phases require different kind of leadership. And that's really interesting, right? So in the kind of exploration phase, it's a very entrepreneurial, big idea phase. So you really do need to have people that have lots of enthusiasm, can generate lots of ideas. You do need to have really good generalists here. There you need to have people that are really good at systems and efficiency. And here you need to have people that can help manage relationships, right? Because there's grieving and loss and all those kinds of things. So different leadership is required in each of the phases. That you really do have to reflect on where are we now and what does this mean for our work. And you know what's interesting about collective impact is your initiative will be somewhere in the eco cycle, but you might bring on something new. You might have a new strategy or tactic, and it will land in a different place in the eco cycle, right? So then you've got to figure out, okay, this new initiative, so you're doing a education cradle to career kind of thing, and you're fairly mature, but then you say, okay, we're going to focus on the early years, and that's new for you. So the early years drop in here, but your collective impact initiative is in the mature phase. And so then you run into clashes, right? So it can be that you will exist at multiple levels and nested. Watch out for the traps. We'll talk about that. And then renewal is really critical in the life cycle of this work. Before I go on, any questions about the eco cycle? Yeah. What's the contextual kind of thing that you're going to face in your community or you know, your community of practice or whatever you're doing in this governance work. So do you have a positive or negative history, prior history of collaboration? You know, that someone had a question about that, right? Both of them will work for you. If you have a negative history, you can say this is about working differently. If you have a positive history, you can say this is about taking it to the next level, right? So I always think that a deficit is actually a sheep in wolf's clothing, no, a wolf in sheep's clothing, right? I guess it's got to go for the positive. In the paper on collective impact, they talk about urgency of the issue as one of the preconditions, and I think that that is really a critical contextual thing here as well. So, you know, does your community, do your key stakeholders perceive that the issue is urgent and important? And what is the data telling you about that issue, right? So that is very critical. And can you galvanize leaders across the sectors around this issue? What's the data telling you? You know, what's the context? You know, does the community buy into this issue? And to what degree? You know, when we know that in Hamilton, when we started talking about poverty, man, there was nobody in that conversation with us. And so we built lots of conversation tables to bring people into the issue, right? And now, I would say if you went into Hamilton and you said, what's Hamilton doing about poverty? Lots of people have been involved. Because we, every year, would talk to between 30 and 40,000 people. You know, we tracked it, right? You know, so you've got to make opportunities for people to be engaged in the conversation and get buy-in. The core group is essential. A convener is essential. And thinking about who is convening the table is, I think, a really good. And then the degree of community engagement. So this is for influential champions, right? The precondition, which I talked about a little bit earlier, and I totally believe it. You know, it's interesting to me, the reason why I land on influential champions so strongly is that our initiative was convened by the City of Hamilton and the Community Foundation. And the story of the CEO of the Community Foundation was very powerful. She said, and the reason why they actually decided to do any kind of poverty work, because when they announced that to their donors, some of their donors actually walked away from the Community Foundation. They said, that's not what a community foundation does. But she went to an international conference in Germany, and she was talking about all the great things that were happening in the community, and there was a colleague of hers from another community foundation that said, if you were really doing such great things with your donor money, why is there such a high degree of poverty in your community? And that conversation hit her smack in the face. And then she was compelled to act, right? So that kind of personal resonance of influential champions is really critical. I do think you have to think about, you know, and this is where multiple collective impact initiatives in a single community really comes into bear. What is our capacity to support some of these? You know, to support 1, 2, 5 of these kinds of things. You know, the Memphis Fast Forward is an excellent example of how in Memphis they've taken multiple backbone work and have then put it under the banner. So they have these kind of things happening and then a nested approach in terms of moving Memphis forward. I would say that they probably had a really strong degree of really strong prior history of collaboration, and they figured out a strategy that allows for that nesting to happen, and they have the right champions at the right levels of the nesting. So if there are multiple ones in your community, you've got to figure out how do these fit together. In Hamilton, when we were doing the work, we saw that there were already these really influential collaborative tables that existed in our community. And I have to say, I learned a lesson in reaching out to them. The first table I went to, I said, hey, look here's our shared outcomes. And they said, no, right? And they said, no, those aren't our shared outcomes. Those are your outcomes that you want us to share. The next table that I went to, I said, what do you think our shared outcomes are going to be? And I had a blank piece of paper, not a prescribed piece of paper. And I think that that's the method that if you want to do nested work with multiple collaboratives is to say, to do that process together, to make it iterative, right? To say, look, we think that we have something in common. We're not sure what it is. but here's what we know about us. What do you know about you guys? And can we have mutually, can we have those activities that are shared? The ability to identify and engage partners around the same issue, that's around the issue, is really critical. And then, you know, I think that it is, you do need to have conversations both at the collective impact table, but I think also if you're going to have a nested approach in your collaboratives, what are the risks and what are the rewards of being part of this process? Because there are both, right? And I think we have to surface those tougher conversations. So in Hamilton, there were 2 collaboratives that were working at the same time, the Jobs Prosperity Collaborative and Poverty, and you would think that that's kind of 2 sides of the same coin, which they were. They were sharing things together. And so here they did an evaluation of, you know, what were the pivot points for these 2 collaboratives, and here are the 5 things that these 2 collaboratives had in common, right? A clear and pressing issue was really a motivator for them that only a collaborative table could tackle. So they said, you know, we recognize that none of us individually can tackle these. The need to get the right kind of leadership, good staffing, the role, really defining what the role of the collaborative will, what it will do and what it doesn't do. And in both cases, both collaboratives landed not on the actual doing, because there were lots of organizations that were involved in the doing. They landed in that other space, right? That space of complexity where they were shifting systems, whether it was political systems, whether it was decision-making systems, funding systems. They landed in that space, both of them. And then a whole notion of balancing progress and process. At Tamarack, what we've learned is these 5 things, right? And they're pretty straightforward, and we'll talk about them all, so I won't go into much detail here. So I'm going to stop here and just have you guys have little discussion about the first big ideas, right? This idea of a collaboration spectrum, this notion of working in complexity, and this idea of local context and how local context is impacting the work that you do. And just what I want you to do is in your groups talk about, so what does this mean for us? Are those ideas helpful? Did we hit any bumps in the road in our collaborative work? Or, you know, is there something missing in those kind of core ideas? Okay? So you can cluster around or you can move around in a little group. Any quick observations that you have in your conversation? It's complicated, or is it complex? Complex, yeah. Which of those big ideas really resonated for you the most in your little group? Oh, so you didn't get past the spectrum? Okay. Okay, yeah, so it is a really good place to start, you know. I think I've found it to be very, very helpful. Okay, so now we're going to rock and roll through these last couple of ideas because I was asked, am I going to actually show what it looks like? So I will. So this is David Crislip. He has his collaborative premise, and his field book is actually very good. He works right now out of the Kansas Leadership Center. And I think his premise actually holds a lot of really good water with collective impact work. So he says if you bring the appropriate people together in constructive ways with good information, they will create authentic visions and strategies for addressing the shared concerns of the organizations and the community. So, you know, appropriate people, you don't need everybody. You need to have the appropriate people. And, you know, lots of tables get stuck because they feel like they have to have someone at the table and that person isn't ready to be there or that organization isn't ready to be there. So go with the appropriate people. Give them good information. That's about the data, right? And it's about what do we know about our community and who's doing what. So that's good. And give them the ability to create the common agenda, that shared vision. So a lot of what David has to say actually is very well represented in collective impact. So he talks about these premises that actually are important, or shared agreements, so that there is this shared concern, right? That none of us can move the needle on this issue alone, that we actually do need to have a variety of players to get us to move on this issue. That we do need to work together, that we have to figure out how we're going to work together. That's those ways of working together, that we have a shared understanding of the problem. And, you know, I talked about the kind of leveling the playing field about how we understand that problem. Well, data will give you a certain amount. Those personal stories around the problem give you another lens on the problem, right? A lot of you guys do systems mapping, who's doing what in our community around this issue. That's also very critical in this work. Agreement on solutions and agreement on action steps. So this comes out of some of the work that we did in Canada. We were looking at our roundtables and looking at what are those shared values that they have. And so these were some of the broad categories that surfaced when we did a round of their shared values, right? So they kind of talked about transparency and accountability. They talked about equity and inclusiveness as values. They talked about responsiveness. This one about form neutrality. It doesn't matter what the intervention is, we are going to move the needle, right? So that's a really critical one. And then consensus-based decision making. So it is really important to talk about that. These are those really big wiggle words, right? And so you say, oh, we're form neutral. Well, your community doesn't know what that means. So you've got to figure out, okay, how are we going to translate it into language? So, you know, the language we used at, in Hamilton, no blame. We are a no blame, all accountable table. And people got that, right? I think that's really where collective impact is so brilliant, is the language is so accessible. And sometimes we think in organizational speak and we talk in organizational speak. So how do we get to, you know, transparency? What would we say for transparency? We're going to be open, right? We're not going to hide anything. All the cards are on the table, right? Those are the kinds of things we'll use. So we have done a bit of a riff. Who's read anything by Ron Heifetz? So he talks about adaptive leadership. So at Tamarack, we kind of did a riff on Ron Heifetz and his work to say, what are some of those leadership capacities that you need? So if you're doing this work, what are the 10 kind of capacities that you should have, you know, that will really help you do this work? So you should have an ability to reach out and convene diverse stakeholders, right? To be in the place where you know that they're going to come with different kinds of expectations, that they're going to have different kinds of needs, particularly if you're including people, you know, that haven't been at these decision-making tables before. How do you balance the power around those tables? You've got to have the ability to focus on that issue and to continue to maintain that focus on that issue. And the clarity, I think, you know, common agenda, yes. High aspiration is really, it can be so motivational for a community if you have kind of this high aspiration. We had making Hamilton the best place to raise a child, right? High aspiration. We used to have, well, what about the best place to raise seniors or the best place to have waterfalls? It didn't matter as long as the best place, people were aspiring to be the best place. We didn't care. We wanted to be the best place for children. That was what we were pushing. But that whole idea that a community can be inspired to be the best place to be something, right? That's really very cool. Framing, a good enough vision, chunking work and linking it together, right? Putting the pieces together. That's about mutually reinforcing activities. Multiple actions. The one I like is maintaining productive distress. So what do you think that means in this work? Because we've all felt it. What do you think it means?
Conflict is the midwife to change concept.
Oh, really? That's great. That's a great saying. Conflict is the midwife to change. Yeah. And you were going to say something, Colleen.
Maintaining urgency.
Yeah. And it's also about that tension, right? Quick results, long-term change, right? Process, product, all those tensions. I remember going into my elected official's office at the city government and they said, so Liz, how many people did you move out of poverty today? you know, that's that productive distress. And so you got to figure out, how do I reframe this so we can have a productive conversation about this, right? It's quite cool to think about that. And then acknowledging, you know, I think that this is the thing, this final one, acknowledging multiple accountabilities, particularly in collective impact, right? You've got to say, what does this group of stakeholders need? What does this group of stakeholders need? Sometimes they're the same messages, sometimes they're very different, and not to think that one message fits all. So if you're going to set up a governance model, these are things that you should be thinking about in your model, right? What leadership, what staffing? That's a little unfocused, isn't it? Ooh, there you go. What's the member motivation? Who's going to step up to the plate in certain ways? How are we going to select members? There's a very cool community, Medicine Hat, Alberta, and they have decided that in order to get buy-in, anyone who comes to a meeting about their work is part of their collaborative roundtable. Now that's crazy making, because they have 160 people now that are, you know, their collaborative roundtable members, and they have a smaller steering committee that's driving forward the work, but it's an interesting model, right? That's how they've landed in their kind of approach. Some other things to think about are there, sometimes this work is hard, well, mostly this work is hard, so are there people that will help balance power by being a process guide? And do they know enough about collective impact that they will help the table when you hit a bump in the road, right? And that is really critical. Those process guides, you know, those people that will facilitate some of the harder discussions, and they come in as a neutral third party is really important. And then things like geographic proximity, financial capability, resource capacity, those are all things to consider. This is how we see, this is the Tamarack approach to collective impact. What we really believe is you need community ownership right at the center. It is critical to this work, right? In fact, it should be the driver, and all the other pieces should be kind of fitting into it. There's usually a convener or multiple conveners that actually bring the table together in the first place and actually journey along with you in your work. That convener might also be the fiscal sponsor. In Canada, that's usually the case, that the organization that convenes holds a fiscal sponsor, and then the backbone is actually infrastructure. So in Canada, the backbone, the way that it has evolved for us is it's usually a very small staffing team, 1 to 3 people. And then they exist, they are housed in the convener's organization, right? So they're not a separate organization, they're more of an infrastructure. In the United States, it's different, right? So if you look at Strive in Cincinnati, they have a whole team and they are themselves an organization. So it looks different depending on different contexts and different how it evolves. Canada has a lot less big funders, so we have to be a little bit more nimble and flexible in our approach.
Just wondering if you've seen models where effective demonstration of community ownership when you're at the statewide level.
Huh, that's a good question. In that case, the ownership would lie in the partners that are depending on how you define it, might lie in the partners that are leading the collective impact initiatives in their own communities. So ownership is not at that level. Community is defined differently at the state level. And that would be the same at a national level as well. So you've got to define what is our community, right? So it's not the people living right across the state. Our community might be this network. The backbone staffing and their leadership tables might be your community, and then to what degree do you influence that community? And then to what degree do they influence their communities?
Right, you have to have all the criteria for them that they have access to their local community.
Yeah, so you've got to think about that kind of thing, yeah.
So I've used the continuum that you showed before, and thank you for that, because it's amazing and really crystallizes it for folks. This, to me, is sort of reminiscent of the node and hub model that Geo came out with recently. And I think when I shared that with partners, that was an interesting conversation as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because
so what came out of that conversation?
Well, I proposed it to partners and said, does this look like what we're doing? And because I think what I saw was in that centerpiece was one organization and everybody else was around. And I was trying to say, I don't think that this Node and Hub model really reflects what we're trying to do. Reflects what some of us are trying to do versus others. So having some way of visually, really quickly being able to get on the same page of what our model is, that's a step above sort of roles and responsibilities is really critical.
So if you want to think about, so that's a really great point, and if you want to think about community ownership, it's actually who is the, what is the needle you're trying to move? That's really, and how does the community buy into that, right? So that in the case of Hamilton, the community is the 620,000 people that, in some way are affected by the issue, right? That's about community ownership. So I think it is, there's probably more to be, so that's a really good point. Both of your points are really good because they're connected, is to think about, what are each of these and how do you define them so that they're helpful to people. We have done a little bit, oh, I don't have that in the slide. I thought I did. I'll send it to you. I'll add it into my PowerPoint. But we have taken each of those 6, 7 areas, and we've kind of talked really high level about what some of the roles are for each of those 7 areas. So I'll add that in to the PowerPoint. Just let me finish. I'll be really quick. So the leadership table is the broad 40 to 50 or however many people you have. There's often a smaller steering committee. So what we've seen in Canada is the leadership table meets every other month, or they might meet monthly, and sometimes they meet quarterly. So they're really, you're trying to get all the broad stakeholders in. And then there's usually a smaller steering committee. And then there are, this has a whole bunch of names, but it's an action-oriented group, right? Or a whole bunch of groups that are doing the work. Who had the question here? Yes.
That's what I was just going to ask you, is the difference between the convener and the backbone organization in your organization?
So in Canada, the convener is, it could be a United Way, it has taken multiple forms. So it could be a United Way, could be a community foundation, could be a municipal government, could be a large organization in the community that has capacity. It even has been, in some cases, a business organization, and they are convening the leadership table, essentially, right? So they're the ones that said, hey, we got to do something about X, Y, or Z.
Are they convening all of this?
They initially convene the leadership table, and then they become a member of the leadership table. Mostly they do. And they sometimes will also house the staffing of the backbone.
And what is the backbone organization?
It's usually 1 to 3 staff people.
And their roles are?
They work in service of the leadership table or the steering committee. They work to, so we talked, Faye did a really great job yesterday talking about the 6 roles for a backbone. That's what this staffing infrastructure does, is advance those 6 roles, right? Advancing policy, working at shared measurement, looking at opportunities for mutually reinforcing activities, looking for funding opportunities that then go in to help the community advance around the issue. So that's really the backbone. What's interesting in this kind of a model is if the backbone sits within the convening organization, there is a reporting responsibility that these backbone staff have to the convener because of the financial kind of relationship that's there, and also there's a fiscal arrangement, but there's also a human resource implications kind of arrangement. So there's accountability there. There's accountability absolutely to the leadership table and the steering committee, because they are the ones that are kind of, that is the collective impact work. And then there is accountability to working groups, because this is where mutually reinforcing activities can lie, and then to community. So that's where there are the different layers of accountability.
Do you find that the convening role is it's advantageous to have that separate from the backbone?
Well, it is in the backbone. It is connected to the back. They're not really separate. They have a relationship to one another. Yeah. Okay? Yes?
Can you differentiate between the roles of those that are in the leadership table and those that are on the steering committee?
Sure, they're the same. There are people that are on both, right? So a certain sector of a leadership table is on a steering committee. And it's really, you know, if you think about a normal organizational structure, and not every collective impact initiative does this, but a normal organization has an executive committee and a board of directors, right? So your leadership table is your board of directors, and your steering committee might be your executive committee. Often the leadership, what we've seen as it's evolved is the leadership table becomes more advisory, and it actually contains like people that are representing a broad swath of sectors in your community. And the steering committee really takes on that pragmatic management kind of role of the initiative, right? So they would be the people that would hire the staff that work in the backbone, for example. They might be the people that are saying, you know, are we on track? How are the measures happening? Those kinds of things. They are the ones that are kind of really more intensely involved in the management part of it. But you would take that back to the leadership table for sure.
So is the leadership, I guess I'm thinking specifically of the initiative I'm with.
Sure.
They found that they have something like a leadership table, but because they're not as involved as the steering committee, they end up just being like a rubber stamp group.
So yeah, so that happens a lot. And so you really need to think about, and this is about relationship management and accountability, right? You've got to be very clear about what the roles and responsibilities are at each level, and to really talk about, you know, if you're on this, these are your roles and responsibilities. If you're here, these are your roles and responsibilities, right? So I think that that is really essential in letting people know, if they are an advisory committee, what are you seeking their advice around, right? What are those things that are really critical that they can give you advice? And then go to those meetings with those pivot points. The other thing I think that is really what we found is memorandums of understanding. You can't discount that, right? That is about what are the rules of us working together in this kind of way. So if you do have a convener that is holding fiscal and human resource responsibility, what's the memorandum of understanding about that? Because people can quickly drop into the role of, oh, we're working in service of the community foundation or the United Way, right? That's that whole powerful host thing. So a memorandum of understanding really helps you say, no, they have responsibility here. They're going to be our fiscal sponsor, and they're going to hire staff, or they're going to hold the office for the staff. But the hiring of the staff lands here, right? And the firing of the staff lands here. Yeah.
Back to the steering committee. Is that a committee that's representative of your constituency groups?
That's the best outcome for your steering committee, is to not make it single sector, to make it sure that on the steering committee you are representing different groups. Okay. Couple questions. Couple more questions. Oh my goodness.
The same thing about calling it a leadership table.
Yeah.
We have a stakeholders group, but I think by calling it the leadership table, maybe it helps keeping it high level.
Yeah.
Because so people identify with that as being kind of the decision makers for all of these different parts coming together. I think that's a really good terminology.
It really depends on, what works for you guys. This worked for us, but it was helpful, right? It was helpful to say, this is the type of person that we want at this table. And it really came out of, influential leaders, that whole notion of influential leaders, right? Yes?
You keep throwing out the term of powerful host.
Yes.
Could you...
Okay.
What you said earlier, you said a lot about it, but you haven't yet.
So there are some real challenges when you have funders who are also the conveners, right? Or you have municipal government as the convener, because people make assumptions about them because of who they are. They're influential. They have a role to play in community. They have a fiscal relationship with some of the partners around the table because they give them money, right? And so some of your voluntary sector partners are at the table because the community foundation convenes them, right? So you've got to be very clear up front about that. What is that role and what is the relationship? And to what degree are you going to put into your structure things that balance out that power, because that is a power dynamic around the table, and you've got to be able to disclose that. And so powerful host is really, both for the convener to disclose themselves why they're in the work and why they think this is important and why it isn't business as usual for them as the convener, right? That they do believe that this is about community change and that they are one player, but only one player in a whole constellation of players.
Follow-up question.
Sure.
If the fiscal sponsor serves as the powerful host in the early stages, and ultimately the goal is to switch to a backbone, so much of the early work is building trust. You spend 2 years building trust and say, okay, now we're going to you off to someone else. How do you manage that?
So one of the things we've used as tools is a memorandum of understanding, so people understand what those relationships are. The other thing that we have found to be very helpful is not to have a single funder embedded in this process, right? We really look for multiple investors in this work and to level the playing field of investment. So to say, organizations can invest in this work by providing space, funders can provide some resources, the business community can come in with some funding. So the more investors you have in the work, the more resilient the initiative is if a funder leaves, right? Or if a partner leaves. You actually are building much more resilience into your design by having multiple investors at a whole bunch of different levels. And that's, again, the sphere of influence idea, right? The fact that not only are you going to be at the table, you and your network, but you're investing in this in some kind of way that is real and tangible. It doesn't all have to be about money, but having multiple players have some skin in the game, as we called it, is a really great strategy for resilience. Yeah.
So where does the big decision making happen in this structure? And I'm talking about major pivots, course corrections, not sort of operational management. Like where does that happen here?
So operationally, the steering committee and the staff would, day-to-day management kind of stuff. But for it to be really successful, I think, for collective impact to be really successful, you've got to think about what are the decisions that we need to bring to the leadership table, because they are influencers, right? They are people of influence in a sphere of influence, and we need their buy-in. And then to what degree, oh my God, to what degree do we have to take it back to the community to really build community ownership? And I think you need to build in these reinforcing loops all the time. Because if you build in those reinforcing loops, then you will be much more successful in terms of that. But operationally, here and here, and to some degree here, strategically here and here. Okay? I gotta go. I'll answer your question. I just want to show you this model. I'll jump over that. Oh, here are those slides. So these are the roles. I should go back. There's also, even though those are roles, there's lots of other things that people can do in a community. So let's not just think about those 6 roles. People can be investors, they can be data providers, champions, all sorts of things like that. Access to other levels of government. The world is your rainbow in collective impact, right? We are only limited by our imagination. Okay. So this is the constellation model. And we found a very cool kind of model. There's a great resource. Called, if you Google it, the Constellation Model of Governance. But, no, it's simple. It's simple. This is your leadership table. They call it the stewardship group, right? So there are partners around the stewardship group. This is the backbone staffing, and the backbone staffing both provides support to the stewardship group, but also provides support to the constellations, which are your working groups or your action teams. And the idea behind a constellation model of governance is like a star, right? It comes from the atmosphere. A star has energy, and then it burns out, right? So you only work on things that have energy, and when the energy dissipates, you let them go, right? So don't try to, I got that. I'm going to go quick now. Don't try to push anything. There should always be a link between a lead partner from your stewardship group and someone on your constellation, so that the work of the constellation kind of feeds back into the stewardship group. The shared vision is actually the common agenda. And the magnetic attractor, which is the, the goofy Canadian thing, is really, it really is the need or the opportunity that presents itself. So it's actually quite a cool little model. Enabling factors are that there should be lightweight governance agreements in the design, that it has action-focused constellations, and that there is third-party coordination, that there is this backbone that really helps move everything forward. It's a great little model. A couple more slides really quickly. So the stewardship group sets, so these are the roles of the stewardship group. They set the vision and the strategic direction. So they would play the roles, the 6 roles of the backbone and the kind of backbone team. They monitor the overall health. Are we still working well, or are we a sick little entity? They align constellations with the purpose, the overall purpose, and they determine and provide support. And their core governance documents are their guiding principles, their terms of reference, and their plan. The constellations are their subsets of partners and their activities. They're very action-oriented, right? Lots of energy, lots of people kind of wanting to move around them. It's interesting, USBC, the United States Breastfeeding Committee, just actually presented this model of governance to their, so they're working at a national level. They presented it to their national partners and to some other people, and there was, I heard, a ton of excitement about this work and really seeing the fact that some of their partners could lead on some of the constellations and they didn't actually have to do all the work, right? It's really about dispersing the work across people that have energy to get the work done. So it's quite a cool model in that way. So that's a really quick version of the constellation model. There's lots of stuff written about it. It adapts really nicely to collective impact, right? Because it is very fluid. There's lots of energy behind it. And there are some really interesting roles that people can play.
Do the lead partners in each constellation generally serve on the stewardship group?
Yes. So yeah, absolutely. That's where the connection is. But what it says is that also on that constellation can be lots of other partners in the community, right? So it's a really a pathway for other people to get involved in the initiative beyond just the people that are on your stewardship group or on your leadership table. So it's really about spreading the net wider and wider. Any other quick questions before I jump really quickly?
Can you talk a little bit about the order and chaos line there?
Oh, yeah. So these are the people that kind of know what the whole system looks like and have order to it and have these kind of systems in place. Chaos is really, it's that it's emergent, right? So an opportunity might present itself and people will come to the stewardship group and say, oh, there's a policy issue that here we see a window of opportunity to advance this policy around living wage, and we have people that really want to work on it. So then the stewardship group finds a partner who will align with the constellation, and they will work on that window of opportunity. So it is a little bit chaotic because it's sometimes the people that are engaged here might know of this work, but may not have that same kind of depth of knowledge, right? So you're using their energy to help drive the work forward. Yeah.
And so because of that, how much tension is there between the steward group and the work that's happening outside of that table?
The role of the stewardship is to always hold the shared vision in place, is to really make sure that there is alignment, right? So there was always tension, right? There's always tension because, if the collective impact work exists at a level where you're trying to shift the system, so you're working at policy and how people are working differently and those kinds of things, not actually doing the tangible work. What you're doing is that shifting the system. There's tension in that work, right? Because, there are people that are going to feel comfortable in that domain. Then there are people going to say, oh, I don't think we can step out on that policy area because, if I'm from local government, that might impact me and I've got to figure out how I can fly that within my municipal government. Or if I'm the United Way, I've got to think about my donors. And so there's always, I think, tension in that middle space. So it is a little chaotic too. So if you like chaos, great. I love it. Okay. So here are some other things to think about in your governance structure, right? You've got to think about what are the characteristics of our membership, how are we going to make decisions, what's the authority, how are we going to communicate. You know, that's what I think is really brilliant about collective impact is this idea of continuous communications, right? We don't think about those things, and yet to get buy-in, you've got to be so thinking about that kind of stuff. And not thinking about if we send out an email, then we've communicated with everybody. Oh my God, that just doesn't work. Leadership style, culture, and how sponsorship works within this whole structure. Some of the roadblocks, I have a small list here, but I'm sure you could add many, many more roadblocks to it. You know, the one thing is this notion that we're too big to fail, right? We have too many influential people. We are like the cat's meow. There's lots of people that will be there, not. And then this is my final slide. This is Peter Drucker, right? So this is my homage to Peter Drucker. No matter what you do, culture is a driving force. So culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So you really do have to pay attention to the culture. So I don't know if that's helpful at all. Those are just our observations about collaborative governance. You will get copies of all the slides. Yeah. And on our website, oh yeah, one other thing. Oh, I didn't do it on this one. I will. I'll add it in. I have lots of really good links to tools and resources, and so I'll add in a slide. Because on the Tamarack website, we're always kind of looking at tools and resources and how do you apply this stuff. So for sure, I'll put a slide of links up. Thank you. Sorry, that was really quick.